Hi everyone. For my portion, I'm covering Eric Williams' Capitalism and Slavery, chapters 6 through 9, as we talked about in another class. It's crazy how this work was written so long ago, yet it's so insightful in terms of like the impact of this, like the historiography. The thing I liked most about this section was like the nature of relationships and seeing how that changed over time, and just like the dependence, first of all, the dependence on each other, and then to more of a capitalistic everyone for their own kind of ideal. So I thought that was an interesting argument too, seeing that gradual transition to that. Definitely is something very important to the historiography, just because no one really talks about it in this way. I think it kind of set the standard for the subject. Um, what I wish this section was set up more chronologically rather than like thematically. I feel like after chapter 6, you kind of have to like put yourself in a different place each chapter and kind of like gaining your ground again, rather than being able to kind of like follow along like linearly. Um, like the first chapter is the American Revolution, and it just basically sets the scene like, hey, Jamaica and Britain are basically the best of friends. Like, Britain loved Jamaica because Jamaica provided a lot of sugar for them. And because of this trade off, Britain made sure that they were well established for them. And since Britain was such a power, they basically set the tone for the industry. Like, they set the price and everyone paid it because it was Britain. So everyone was kind of like forced to comply with them. When America gained its independence, they entered the market with some skin in the game. Basically, because of these relationships that they formed before, they knew who to call, they knew who to kind of like set things up with. So they weren't completely lost, and I think that's what surprised Britain, and they weren't really expecting America to stand on its feet as quickly as it did. And that changed the nature of these relationships because the world economy began to become more capitalistic rather than like in the mercantile system. Um, so basically, Britain kind of changed everything in response to this. Um, Once they did that, and then they established like this navigation law, it destroyed that network that they had that I talked about earlier. And basically, Britain started to move their focus from Jamaica to India. Then in chapter 7, the development of British capitalism basically kind of covers like Britain's response to American independence economically. Basically, the biggest like transition during this time was Britain's reliance on wool. Basically became more industrialized and started to focus more on cotton. So you see like the establishment of cotton mills around the country. Basically, the industry moved from agricultural to industrial, and you see like a lot of like ironwork being done, and basically kind of forcing sugar planters to the side compared to in previous years where they were really in charge of that industry, or the economy. And basically, Britain started to gain monetary value as it acted as like a creditor to other nations, and they began to rely less on like their colonies, as they began to gain more power with this like creditor system. And then in chapter 8, like the new industrial order, a quote that I really liked was the attack on the Indians was more than an attack on slavery. It was an attack on monopoly. Their opponents were not only the humanitarians, but the capitalists, which is on page 135. I think that's so interesting because it adds like another layer to the abolition argument. Um, Basically, they wanted to grow in their own power, so it it wasn't just for humanitarian rights. Like, there was a political reasoning for that. So I think it's just so interesting to see kind of how that came about. Um, and basically, slavery, like as an industry, was ultimately like detrimental to Britain, and because it wanted to become more capitalistic, and you couldn't really do that when you kind of have this industry kind of like looming over you. Um, and it also changed like the economy of the West Indies. It really like challenged their notions because it was all based on like sugar plantations and sugar as an industry, um, and it destroyed it realistically. But through this, the West Indies believed that Britain would still save them because they provided so much sugar to them. And Britain kind of detached themselves from them. Like I said earlier, they focused more on India and like the things that they could get from that area compared to like the West Indies. It still remained like sugar itself remained like a top crop for the time period, but they would prefer it be ran by free labor rather than slave labor. Um, and the West Indies tried this, but they really like they couldn't adapt, and it just wasn't like in the cards. And then soon the global economy became more against colonies and more anti-imperialistic. Basically, like these colonies became too expensive to manage, um, and it just deterred them from gaining capital if they were just spending it on things that they didn't view as well. Um, and so, because of this and the changing nature of the relationships, sugar began to be produced in India, and abolition became a stronger argument during this time. Um, so England was basically trying to make power moves during this time as well. An island William talks about a lot is Saint Domingue, which was owned by the French and was basically a pawn for Prime Minister William Pitt, who could not only use it as like a way to compensate for losing America, but it could also destroy the French's sugar trade, um, which would take another competitor out of the like global economy. And that was happening at the top. So at the lower level, you're seeing planters begin to ask for abolition, as it would give them a chance to have their own type of monopoly rather than the monopoly through Britain. And then sugar slowly began to become overproduced. Wasn't a lot before, and now it was just too much. And because of that, it started to deteriorate at the British monopoly, and like at this point, they're totally forgetting the West Indian colonies. Chapter 9 is British capitalism in the West Indies, which, in my opinion, is probably the saddest chapter because it basically shows each industry kind of turning on the West Indies. Not only is it just Britain saying no, but these individual actors are also saying no. So it's interesting kind of seeing that change in perspective. They really just like hated the slave system. And so basically it was like the cotton industry, the wool industry, the iron industry, not slave, ship owners began to go against them as well. Um, Basically any industry that was prevalent during this time turned their back on the West Indies. And the British government tried to offer a solution, which basically allowed for the emancipation of these slaves, but the West Indies could stay in part of the monopoly. And I think the most ironic part of this is like the capital, after this agreement, basically valued cheap sugar, and they didn't really care who manufactured it, whether it was like slave grown or like freely grown. They just really didn't care. It was all back to like a capitalistic kind of mindset, which I think kind of goes back to like Williams's point, like how integrated slavery was in capitalism. So I think this was interesting because it really takes it to like the dollars and the cents um, of industry and like how the world viewed or how Britain viewed it, and how it once was essential and then it slowly became not as important anymore. So um, I really liked it. Like I said, I wish it was a little bit more linear, but I think it's important to have in the historiography and continuing our talks about capitalism and slavery. So.